A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year.
Dickens refers to food and drink over 5,000 times.
Dickens looked around him, I think, and looked at the extreme contrasts he could see in Victorian London at the time.
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all, and infinitely more.
None of the others have the fire of A Christmas Carol, and I think it's because A Christmas Carol was written with such an intention. It was written to change the world.
I think one of the things you've got to remember at this point is he's very conscious of who his audience are.
I think there's probably the sense that Turkey was a sort of goose on steroids. You know, it was the next best thing up.
I think the interesting thing about Dickens was he is a full-on performer.
Make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit.
Welcome to Inimitable, the very first season of the Charles Dickens Museum podcast. Charles Dickens is, of course, famous for being a writer. He wrote some of the most famous stories in the English language. Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, A Tale of Two Cities. But there was one story which really has come to define him. I am, of course, referring to that wonderful little book, A Christmas Carol. It's not a very large story. It's less than 200 pages long. We call it a novella, not a novel, because it's too small to be considered a novel. And yet its impact has been simply enormous. It came out on the 19th of December, 1843, and it's never been out of print since. So for this first podcast series, I want to look at this incredible story. Why did Dickens write it? Why did he choose Christmas? And what has the real impact of it been on our world and our society? To begin this literary journey, I sat down with Dr. Cindy Sughrue at the Charles Dickens Museum in London. Let's jump straight into it. I'm sure everybody knows A Christmas Carol. It's one of the most famous stories probably in the world. But just in case anybody's been living under a rock, could you tell us what happens in A Christmas Carol?
So this is a story about the old miser, Ebenezer Scrooge, who is visited on Christmas Eve by the ghost of his dead business partner, Jacob Marley. And Marley, in turn, then sends 3 further spirits to haunt Scrooge in an effort to get him to change his harsh, cruel ways, make amends for past wrongs. So the first is the Ghost of Christmas Present, and this character takes Scrooge to revisit scenes of his youth. The next one is the Ghost of Christmas Present, who takes Scrooge to see what Christmas is being celebrated as that year, so contemporary to Scrooge. And that includes going to the home of Scrooge's sole employee, Bob Cratchit, his clerk, and seeing what the very poor Cratchit family gets up to celebrate the festive season. And then the final visitation is the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, the most terrifying of the 3 spirits. And it shows Scrooge what will or what might be if he doesn't change his ways. So it's the ultimate story, I think, of redemption with strong messages about how we can all do a bit in this world to make it a better place for everyone else.
Of course, it's so famous and so many of the characters are so iconic, aren't they? You just think of Scrooge. I mean, he's kind of entered the English language, isn't he? As, you know, he's a bit of a Scrooge, isn't he?
Oh, yes, you can go to a dictionary and you can find the word Scrooge as precisely that, defined as someone who's mean, miserly, curmudgeonly. But I also like another character that perhaps everyone will know, which is Tiny Tim, and that's the youngest member of the Cratchit family who is very ill and may not survive the winter. And I love the fact that this character becomes a little hero in his own right, and perhaps even more important than the 3 spirits that visit Scrooge, this little boy helps the transformation.
But A Christmas Carol, I mean, it's his most famous Christmas story, but it's not, as you mentioned earlier, it's not his only story. What other Christmas novellas did he write?
So Christmas Carol was the first of what's become known as the Christmas books, and he wrote 5 in total, so Christmas Carol in 1843, and over the following 5 years he wrote 4 more books, each exploring different aspects of contemporary life, usually with a strong social message, sometimes political messages as well, with family and home life at the heart of each of these. 2 of them go into slightly darker territory, where Dickens is sort of exploring his own issues with life, his happiness, his unhappiness, and drawing those into a story to be the centre of Christmas. But because of the huge success of A Christmas Carol, he felt this obligation, as people were expecting another novel the next year or some kind of Christmas writing. And even after he left the Christmas books behind, he was always writing something at Christmas time. And during the last 20 years of his life, so from 1850 to 1870, when he was editing a journal, a weekly or monthly journal, a Christmas edition, as we might have today of a magazine, there's a Christmas special. He did that as well. So there would be a Christmas edition with more content, more stories, more entertainment, more seasonal offerings. And he would create something for that, short stories, not giving himself the huge task of coming up with another Christmas book each year, which by the final one, I think even the nature of the 5th of those books feels like he's had enough. He's almost become disillusioned with Christmas.
He's done the reverse journey. He's gone from happy Scrooge to miserly Scrooge.
And I think only because, even though he, perhaps unwittingly became such a key player in the repopularization of Christmas, creating it to what we know of Christmas today, he then became rather cynical of how it became overly commercialized. And he was, unwittingly a contributor to that.
It is quite sad to think that Charles Dickens kind of almost fell out of love with Christmas as time went by. It's almost a bit like hearing Father Christmas doesn't like Christmas Eve. It just feels a bit wrong. But clearly, he was a man who had this enormous impact, even during his lifetime, on the celebrations of Christmas, through A Christmas Carol and indeed the other books that he followed on with. But what I want to know is, why Christmas as opposed to any other time of year? And considering Dickens is often seen as the man who revitalised the Christmas season, who some people have even said he's the man who invented Christmas, how has he gained this reputation as being someone who has changed the way we celebrate the season? To find out more, I sat down with Lucinda Dickens Hawksley. She's the author of a book called Dickens and Christmas, and she also happens to be the 3 times great-granddaughter of Charles Dickens himself. So she's the perfect person to answer our questions.
Well, there's this popular misconception that nobody celebrated Christmas until Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol. But of course, when we look in A Christmas Carol itself, and we look at Fezziwig's Ball, for example, Dickens is showing us what used to happen in a Georgian Christmas, perhaps stories that his parents or grandparents told him, or that he even remembered from his childhood. So Christmas had been celebrated for many hundreds of years, but it had kind of come and gone through a bit of a renaissance, and then it would be lost again, then it would come back. And what people really felt around the time that A Christmas Carol was written was that Christmas needed a renaissance. It had been used to be about charity, about giving alms to the poor, particularly food and clothing. But by the time that Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, he and others had become a little bit disillusioned with the fact that Christmas had become all about feasting, fine clothes, revelry, and not so much thinking about the poor. So when Dickens was thinking about writing a pamphlet for the government about child poverty, and he then thought, well, who's going to read this? It's never going to be read. A politician's going to put it in a drawer. He decided to come up with a work of fiction instead. And what many people don't realise is at the heart of A Christmas Carol is actually a message about child poverty and how it needs to be eradicated. People see it as a lovely, joyous tale of Ebenezer Scrooge's kind of, change and his whole way of looking at life differently. But at the crux of the story is Tiny Tim, and of course the two children, Ignorance and Want, who appear with the ghost of Christmas Present. And they were the real reason why Dickens wrote the story in the first place.
That's really fascinating. It's really interesting to think of the Victorians thinking Christmas is becoming too commercial. That's such a modern subject.
It really is, and it's funny when you actually see that they feel it's all become about the feasting, the fine jewels that are written about in the newspapers that the royal family give to each other, and the clothing. It's all about who's having the grandest dinner party or which duchess is giving a Christmas Eve ball. And people were getting fed up with it.
So when Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol then, was he writing about, from his own memories of Christmas? Was he, when we think about the Cratchits' Christmas dinner, for example, is that coming from memory, or is he kind of saying what he thinks Christmas should be?
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, Christmas in the Dickens household was always popular. So when Dickens wrote A Christmas Carol, he was telling us a lot of what his family did. We know from his letters that Christmas was important and music was very important. And we know that Christmas was celebrated from Christmas Eve right up until Twelfth Night. And that was celebrated in the Dickens family on the 6th of January. There's quite a lot of controversy, or actually, if you count 12 days, it should be 5th of January, but we know that Dickens, from his letters, celebrated on the 6th of January. And we also know from his diaries that many years earlier, Samuel Pepys had also celebrated Twelfth Night on the 6th of January. So there were all these days of celebration. And in the Dickens family, we know that they loved singing and dancing as well as the Christmas meal. Perhaps the Cratchits' Christmas meal was what was happening in Charles Dickens's childhood Christmases, particularly when his father was getting into debt, perhaps just before or just after his time in the Marshalsea prison when Charles Dickens was 12. But we also think that it's possible that these are memories from his grandparents as well. Of course, Charles Dickens's grandmother was a wonderful inspiration to him, his father's mother. She was an upper servant in the house of Lord Crewe, so perhaps she told him about grand parties in the aristocratic household, but also probably parties in the servants' hall. And we know that she was a real influence on Dickens's storytelling, and in fact, in Bleak House, for example, she's a real inspiration for Mrs. Rouncewell, the wonderful housekeeper of Chesney Wold. And this woman told Dickens stories when he was little that would always stay with him. So I like to think that maybe some of his Christmas writing about when Ebenezer Scrooge was a little boy, looking back all those years, maybe they came from his grandmother's stories or other older family members telling him about their Christmases as children.
A Christmas Carol struck a chord, and it's lasted. I mean, it's never been out of print since 1843.
Amazing, so enviable.
Isn't it just? Why is it that we still constantly read A Christmas Carol and don't read necessarily other Christmas books from the period?
I think, and I'm struck by this every time I read it, and I read it every year because I do lots of events around Christmas Carol, I think it's because it's flawless. I mean, I say that as a writer myself. I look at this book and every year I spot something different in it. And I read all of Dickens's Christmas stories. The Haunted Man is definitely my second favourite. I think it's wonderful. But apart from The Haunted Man, which was written after Dickens's sister died, and it's about a man who's grieving his sister, so it's very, very poignant, none of the others have the fire of A Christmas Carol. And I think it's because A Christmas Carol was written with such an intention. It was written to change the world. He wanted to strike out child poverty. And it was written with fury after reading the Blue Book, the report into child poverty that had been commissioned. The others were written because A Christmas Carol was hugely successful and people wanted another Christmas book. And so every year, for several years, Dickens worked on a Christmas story. They're fun, they're interesting. None of them, to me, have that same passion, except for The Haunted Man, that A Christmas Carol has. And I think A Christmas Carol perhaps is so good because it was written in 6 weeks. It's not overwritten, it's not over-edited, and it was written from the heart, and it was written with such love. And it just is wonderful.
If I were to ask you, why do you love Christmas? I'm sure the answer would, at least in part, be nostalgia. We love Christmas because it reminds us of happy times as children, following those same routines, those same traditions, being together with family or loved ones. It fills us with a kind of a warm feeling that we don't often remember as adults. And it's fascinating to think that it's this same rather saccharine feeling of nostalgia which attracted Dickens to Christmas, remembering the stories his grandmother had told him, cherishing those moments he had shared with his family as a child in the festive season. With A Christmas Carol, we have this story which somehow captures that same sense of almost childlike joy at the festive season. And that makes it instantly attractive to us. Dickens provided a narrative, a written reason for why we should love the Christmas period. Now, of course, many people today haven't necessarily read the book. Lots of people watch film versions of it. There's almost a new Christmas Carol every year. There are musicals, there are cartoons, there is, of course, The Muppets Christmas Carol. So many different ways of engaging with this particular story. And what's really interesting is that this idea of adaptations, of musicals even, is not new. To find out more, I spoke to Dr. Frankie Kubicki and Emma Harper, curators at the Charles Dickens Museum.
So we are now sitting in front of a Christmas Carol playbill. So this was a form of advertisement that theatres would have used to try and, advertise their production to new fans and theatre goers. And this one is particularly exciting to us because it is from one of the first productions of A Christmas Carol. So it's dated Monday, February the 19th, 1844.
Wow.
Now, it's really interesting to think about this because A Christmas Carol was adapted and put on the stage from the very get-go. So you've got to think, by February, the book had only been published for 3 months, and they'd already worked on a stage production. This production was actually dramatised and produced by quite a famous theatre producer, Mr. Edward Sterling, and Dickens actually did contribute to this adaptation and did see it. Now, amazingly, very of Dickens's sort of slightly catty side, I would say. He was not overly impressed with the adaptation, but it was one of the only ones that was properly sanctified by Dickens.
There were rudimentary copyright laws in place, but not enough to protect work. So it was very common for almost all of Dickens's fiction to be picked up and adapted even before it was finished. So almost everything he wrote was published in serialized format in usually monthly parts, installments. And stage theatre people would pick this up and make an adaptation while it was still being published over a period of time. So, there might be a version of The Old Curiosity Shop where Little Nell does not die because he hadn't gotten to the end of the novel yet. So a lot of plagiarisms in print form and stage adaptations. The way that you could secure the stage rights of your own work would be to publish a play script at the same time as publishing the novel. Dickens never mastered that, largely because he was writing as the novels were being published. Christmas Carol and his Christmas books are an exception because they were published in a single volume form, being quite short books. Wilkie Collins, one of Dickens's friends and collaborators, and of course a very well-known novelist in his own right, Wilkie would often publish a play script at the same time, and that would secure the rights for the stage. It didn't matter that someone would then do a different stage adaptation. The fact that Wilkie established his copyright over it at that time secured that. Dickens was working too quickly for the most part to be able to do that. But of course, Dickens himself, he was very alive to the fact that people enjoyed seeing his novels brought to life on stage. So he started a series, and then later in life, very actively, publicly reading these dramatized solo readings of his own work. And they were hugely popular, and he made a lot of money presenting, 2 or 3 hours of his own work in adapted form to theatres, to auditoria, 3,000, 5,000, even 10,000 people. And he was the great Charles Dickens presenting his own adaptation. So that was a way he latterly worked around, and people would prefer to see him presenting it in this dramatic form than paying for somebody else to have done a version.
Absolutely, he's the authentic version, yeah. And of course, it wasn't just here in Britain that his work was being adapted, and that he did his readings for, was it? This was a global kind of phenomenon, wasn't it?
Yes, so Dickens shot to international stardom very early in his career, as early as 1837-38 with Pickwick Papers, which he completed here in Doughty Street. And later in life, as he started these dramatic reading tours, he realised there was a market for it in America as well. So he went and travelled for about 6 months around giving these readings. There was even a plan for him to go to Australia and do the same thing, but sadly that didn't come to fruition before he passed away.
But I think it's so exciting because many people's first experiences of A Christmas Carol is, of course, the wonderful films, theatre productions, all these things that go around the festive season. So it's lovely to think that actually that's not new. That was something that the Victorians were doing too, and is very much at the centre of the life of this story.
Absolutely. And what I love about this is that you feel a bit assaulted by this object, actually, in a good way, because you've got all these different sized texts on the page. You've got A Christmas Carol in big capital letters, or past, present and future. And then, a bit like modern film trailers kind of give you the entire film, and you think, do I need to go and see that? The rest of the page is given over to a little summary of sort of the characters and chamber of Scrooge the miser, and the baffled knight and things like this, Fezziwig's ball, and it just really gives you a flavour of the book. And what's interesting to me with my musical hat on is that at some point there's a song called "A Jolly Giant Glorious to See" about the ghost of Christmas Present. So,
Wow.
Musical adaptations of A Christmas Carol are nothing new.
So we could say that this is almost a musical. This makes me feel a lot better about, the first time I encountered A Christmas Carol was watching The Muppets when I was
Still
young.
the best version.
I love to think that, the Victorians weren't that different, were they?
No, I think, this sort of joy and this idea of performance is, yes, it hasn't changed in 200 years. And it's wonderful to think of that, and sadly we haven't got Emma to prepare a version of the song
Thankfully.
for it, but it's wonderful to see.
But you go through all of that, and still the last line here is working of the spell, let the lessons live with you, destiny, ignorance, want. So even on this playbill where they're trying to attract people to the theatre, still the message is about this social and moral responsibility.
That's central to the whole theme of it. That's really lovely. I do remark that, this playbill was done in February. So this play has been done in February. They're doing a Christmas play in February. That doesn't happen now. Right, what's that comment? Do they have the same sort of definition of the Christmas period that we have?
I think particularly in theatres, sort of with the modern day pantomime, which only came into being a bit later, but performances would have gone on till Easter, really, until the next religious event. But also the 12 days of Christmas, right through to 12th night, on the 6th of January. That would have been more of the period rather than centred on one particular day. So it was a real period of feasting after actually a period of fast in December, whereas we're sort of the other way around now, in that we start our Christmas parties in December and just keep going. Actually, that would have been the reflective time, the thinking of the charitable good, and then you would have had your celebration starting at Christmas Day, but for the 12 days of Christmas. And for Charles in particular, he had an added reason in that his son Charlie, he was born on 12th night, so they always had a big birthday celebration on 12th night as well.
Yeah, it was fantastic because it was a sort of double whammy of Charlie's birthday party and a big 12th night celebration, which was this huge period of feasting with games.
And in fact, Angela Burdett Coutts, who I mentioned earlier, was godmother to Charlie, and she would always send him what was known as a 12th night cake for his birthday, so a bit like the modern Christmas cake.
I've really started to get a sense here that Christmas was a time that was just adored by Charles Dickens. He saw it as a time of joy, of happiness, one of the few times in the year where people would try that little bit harder to be more loving, more compassionate, more happy. It was a love which was formed in his childhood, And it was a story which really captured the zeitgeist, which tapped into this desire not just within Dickens but within so many other people to cherish Christmas as a time of love and celebration. And I guess it's that very real sense of love and passion which has ensured A Christmas Carol has remained as powerful and as poignant throughout the centuries which followed. Nostalgia is a powerful emotion. It's private, it's intimate, it's something which almost seems to sit in our heart. And A Christmas Carol, because it taps into our sense of nostalgia, because it's a story which often has been with us since childhood, it means something to us in a way that many other stories don't. We are nearly at the end of our very first episode, but before we go, I wanted to share some very special reflections with you. I was thrilled to be joined by one of the patrons of the Charles Dickens Museum, Miriam Margolyes.
I always come to it every year with such joy. Why? Well, it's a cracking good story, and it's quite scary. It is a ghost story, after all, but so much more than that. And I think it expresses the Christmas spirit that Dickens wonderfully embodied all his life, or at least tried to. The redemption, the change in people that's possible when they become good. People grow in A Christmas Carol. It's not miserable. There is the hope of life. It starts cold with the snow and people rushing through it and everybody's clenched and tight, and then it closes with the warmth of the smoking bishop and the good humour of Scrooge. He has become a changed man. It gives us all hope, and I think that spirit is what makes it such a joy to read every time I come to it. A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavour to assist your struggling family, and we will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop, Bob. Make up the fires and buy another coal scuttle before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit.
Wasn't that wonderful? A Christmas Carol is, of course, this beautiful festive book. It embodies the love that Dickens had for the festive season. However, it wasn't written just to be a nice book. A Christmas Carol had a darker purpose, and it was written at a very stark time in British history. In the next episode, we take a look at the world of A Christmas Carol.
The 1840s, I think, is a very sort of desperate time.
They did not have the sort of social security systems that we have today, and if you didn't have a family network who could support you, you could suffer terrible, terrible poverty.
And he saw the structures of politics, law, religion doing very little or nothing at all to make a difference.
But I think his whole approach just sort of echoes what we say today is, you might only be 10 steps away from homelessness.
Inimitable is produced and presented by me, Jordan Evans-Hill. Our contributors are Dr. Cindy Sughrue, Dr. Frankie Kubicki, and Emma Harper, as well as Dr. Lee Jackson, Penn Vogler, Lucinda Hawksley, Miriam Margolyes, and Simon Callow. Thanks for listening.